Welcome back to my channel for part 2 of my comparison between the new Fuji GFX100RF, the Leica Q3 28mm and the Leica Q3 43mm. And by the way, a comparison of the two Q3 cameras you already find on my channel. I will post the link down below in the info box so you can look this up. And this second part of my comparison is no longer about general specifications, about the lenses, the design of the camera body, the mechanical elements, and all of that. It's really about image quality. We'll go deeply into the topic, and I will provide a comparison which hopefully gives you data points to decide which one of these three cameras is for you, which one would you prefer. Let's get this started. Let's do some housekeeping first. So first of all, if you have not yet subscribed to my channel, please do so. Subscribe, hit the notification bell, support my content if you like it, and I will be grateful for it. The second point I want to make is that I will shoot all images and sample images in this video here under studio conditions. And if you could see the side of the studio on my back, it's actually closed in terms of shades on the windows because I don't want that the sun slips in and out and changes the lighting here in the studio. I really do not want to have any artifacts in the images. So that's the way we go for it. My photo model for the shooting will be my beautiful Jennifer, of course. Most of you who follow me on my channel know Jennifer well. She's my most patient photo model ever. And she's always good for sample images and testing out cameras and gear. And now let's go right into the topic.
All right, let me quickly explain what I did in order to find out how these cameras perform. What I did shoot first for each of the three cameras is a benchmark image. And I set the parameters in a way that I get the correct exposure. I shot all images with widest open aperture on all three cameras. That means on the Fuji in f4, on the Leica Q3 28 and f1.7, and on the Leica Q3 43 and f2.0 because that's an aposomicron lens. And I also did choose the base ISO on all three cameras, which is, as far as I know, ISO of 100. So here's an example of an image. ISO 100, f1.7, 1/160 seconds gives me the correct exposure for the Leica Q3 with the Summilux 1.7 widest open 28mm. The next step in the procedure is I produced stressed images. And what do I mean by stressed? So I underexposed up to 5 full stops, I overexposed up to 3 full stops, and I also did choose 2 quite high ISO values. So here's an example. This image here is still shot at an ISO of 100. I keep my rule of thumb to keep the aperture widest open for the Leica Q3 28, but I did shoot at 1/5000 seconds, which is 5 full stops of underexposure if the correct exposure happens at 1/160 seconds. Next, I then in Lightroom corrected the underexposed image, which means I pushed the slider on the exposure side up by 5 full stops. And you see now the two images are matching. So the benchmark image and the stressed image, they kind of look exactly the same. At least they have the same exposure. Then I exported the benchmark image and the stressed image into JPEG. Why did I do that? Why did I not do my analysis on RAW files? Well, of course, if you take your SD card or what have you out of your camera and you upload the image to your MacBook, you will choose the RAW file. But after post-processing, at a certain point in time, the JPEG image typically is what you use for social media, for prints, what have you. Well, you might use the TIFF image, but you will definitely not go in the end product for the RAW file. So I exported here into JPEG on both images, and then I actually did feed both of these JPEGs into a Python script, which I'm going to explain in a moment. The Python script you see here in the upper right-hand side corner works as follows. First, I'm loading the benchmark image and I'm loading the stressed image. And I do this in like-for-like pairs. So benchmark image for the Fuji versus stressed image for the Fuji and benchmark image for the Leicas versus stressed image for the Leicas. Then I determine the pixel dimension. On the Fuji side, the resolution will be 102 megapixel. And on the Leica side, it will be around 60 megapixel. Then I convert the two images I want to compare into grayscale images. That means instead of 3 color channels, I only have intensity, which is in 1 channel only. Next, I generate the difference image. That image contains the information by how much the stressed image, let's say with a higher ISO, or a stressed image with underexposure or overexposure, differs from the benchmark image. And then I'm calculating the mean square error and the peak signal to noise ratio of the difference image. And the mean square error, in a nutshell, calculates the average squared difference between each pixel in the benchmark and stressed images. And if you have a 0, that's the minimum mean square error, means the two images are 100% identical. The maximum MSE in that setup equals 65,025, so I can also, and show it in the table, calculate MSE in percent. A low MSE always means that the two images are more equal. A high MSE means the two images are more different. Next, I'm calculating the average pixel value of the difference image, and the higher the AVP, the more different are the two images, and the lower the AVP, the more similar are the two images. In my opinion, that's the weakest metric I'm using, because it's only a really coarse metric, a coarse measure, but I nevertheless wanted to calculate it here, as I did in the previous video, which I'm referencing in a moment. And then I calculate the structural similarity index, SSIM, of the difference image. And that is designed to measure perceived visual similarity. So how similar or different will a human being perceive the two images, the benchmark image and the stressed image. And the SSIM compares structure, luminance, brightness, contrast in local image regions. And that's the most sophisticated metric I'm applying here. Of course, in Python, I can use libraries and deploy what other people programmed before. Here you just see the execution, how to use that in order to analyze my images. Now, as a matter of fact, the SSIM is always between 0 and 1 in this setup. And the higher the SSIM, the more are the two images structurally similar. So in an ideal case, you would get a 1 or 100%, and that means in the SSIM metric that the two images are exactly the same from a structural perspective. It will never be 100% if it is not exactly the same image, just to be clear. The lower the SSIM, the more are the two images structurally different. I have here a quick comparison of the four metrics, which I have not included in previous videos. And you can basically screenshot that if you want to dive deeper and get more information about how these four metrics work. But for me, this is kind of my lab setup, my laboratory, where I can measure the performance of these cameras when I compare stressed images with a benchmark image. And if you want to learn more about these metrics, I have very, very detailed explanations about where they come from, what the underlying formulas are, how they work, in a video I uploaded some time ago to my channel, and I will post the link down below in the info box so you can look this up, and there you will find much broader explanations and probably also a bit of an educational survey so that you can better understand what I'm doing here if you have not the background in order to work with these metrics. But here at least it gives you in a nutshell a little bit of what's going on, and I will not pause the video to give you time to go through this, but it's on now for a few seconds here, and if you want to screenshot it and pause the video yourself, please be my guest. So here we are now talking about the Fuji GFX100RF, and you see here a bunch of images, 13 photos, and from a distance they all look exactly the same. But there are overexposed images, underexposed images, images with the base ISO, and images with an ISO of 12,800 or 25,600. And they have all been made exposure equivalent by the Lightroom exposure slider. Just to be clear, I have not touched any other slider in Lightroom. There is no post-processing going on here. This is really, what you see here are really the raw files just corrected by the corresponding stops up, down on the exposure slider in Lightroom. Let me make an example to show you what I mean when I said I make these images all exposure equivalent. So here's an example of a stressed image. That's the way I called them before on the left-hand side, where I overexpose the image by 3 full stops. And you see here, this is 1/4 of a second, f4.0. I said before, I shoot all images widest open on the respective camera, an ISO of 100. And then on the right-hand side, on the very right-hand side in the middle, you see the exposure slider in Lightroom, which shows a -3. So that means in my shooting, I overexposed by 3 full stops. And then in Lightroom, I corrected exposure only. No other slider has been touched by 3 full stops to the left-hand side. So I corrected this. You see here another example. This is an example where I underexposed by 1 full stop. On the left-hand side, you see the correct exposure, 1/30 seconds. On the right-hand side, you see 1/60 seconds. And that means I underexposed by 1 full stop. And then in Lightroom, I pushed up the exposure slider by 1 full stop to make the exposure equivalent. And you see here the exposure on these 2 images, left-hand side, right-hand side, is exactly the same. If I do 100% crop into the images, you don't see a noticeable difference. This is a clean image, but we come to more objective ways of measure this, whether these images are the same or not so much the same, in a moment in the course of the presentation. So we can also, of course, load the difference image in the way I explained before into Lightroom. So the difference image is now the difference image between the stressed image and the benchmark image. And if I load this into Lightroom, it's pitch black. So I don't see any difference. But I can, of course, try to play now with the exposure slider to push up the exposure here, and maybe later I see something. So with 0 stops of exposure correction in Lightroom, it's just a pitch black frame. If I push up the exposure slider in Lightroom by 3 full stops, there is still nothing visible. But if I do this by 5 full stops, you see now some structure coming up, and there is actually content in that difference image. You see it here in the frame. So it means that these 2 images are actually not exactly the same. There is difference measurable. And as I said, we come later to the matrix I described before to actually quantify this. The results from the Python script in the matrix I explained before for this particular example are the following. The mean square error is 8, and that's pretty low because I mentioned before that the maximum mean square error is 65,025. So in percentage terms, this is negligible. The peak signal to noise ratio is 39.1. That's actually a good value. The average pixel value is 2.21. So on average, there is in the difference image almost no brightness, which again means that the difference between these 2 images is existent but negligible. And the structural similarity index, so the perceived similarity of these 2 images, the stressed image versus the benchmark image, is at 88.65%, which is a quite strong result here in this example. Here's another example on high ISO. So on the left-hand side, you see my benchmark image. It's 1/30 seconds at f4.0, ISO 100 base ISO. On the right-hand side, you see 25,600 ISO. It's also 1 correction in the exposure slider in Lightroom and 1/4000 seconds. Why do I make a correction here in Lightroom? Well, if I go from an ISO of 100 to 25,600, that's 8 full stops up. But I cannot go more than 7 full stops faster on the shutter speed on the Fuji because 1/4000 seconds with mechanical shutter is end of story. So I have actually chosen here 7 stops faster. So from 1/30 seconds to 1/4000 seconds, and then gave it another stop towards down correction on the Lightroom slider, on the exposure slider in Lightroom. That's the way this works. If you look at before and after here, so on the left-hand side, you see the image with 1/4000 seconds at f4.0, ISO 25,600. On the right-hand side, you see that I adjusted on the exposure slider to a -1, which gives me then the correct exposure, which you saw before in these 13 frames in Lightroom, where from a distance, all of these images looked exactly the same, and they are all exposure equivalent. If you crop in here by 100%, you see noticeable grain and noise on the right-hand side, right? So on the left-hand side is the benchmark image. On the right-hand side is the image with 25,600 ISO. And here you see and feel the noise and the grain. What we are doing now is we take all these 13 frames, we process them through the Python analysis, we collect all the values into a table, and then we compare the results when we have done the same exercise with the 2 Leica cameras. So here are the measurement results. I could now leave this on for the next 10 minutes. You can stare at the table. You will very likely not get much smarter during these 10 minutes. So I will skip it and come back to the numbers later when we looked into the Leica cameras. Here's kind of the same scene now for the Leica Q3 28. We have all in 12 photos, 12 images. From a distance, they all look the same. But in fact, in the same way as for the Fuji, they're overexposed, underexposed, high ISO values, and then made exposure equivalent in the way I explained before. Here's an example we didn't look into on the Fuji side, so let's look into this as an example on the Leica Q3 28 side. So on the left-hand side, we have the benchmark image that's 1/160 seconds, widest open f1.7, ISO 100. And on the right-hand side, you have an image underexposed by 5 full stops, which boils down to the same aperture, same ISO, which is the base ISO, but 1/5000 seconds. And they look exactly the same. But in fact, of course, if you look into before and after in Lightroom under the develop section, you see that the left-hand side by 5 full stops being underexposed is almost pitch black. You recognize a little bit of Jennifer in that image, but only if you correct it in Lightroom, which you see in the middle on the very right-hand side. Pushing the slider up by 5 full stops gives me the correct exposure. And if we crop in now by 100%, of course, underexposing during the shooting process by 5 full stops and then correcting by going 5 full stops up in Lightroom is doing something with the image. And you see here on the left-hand side the benchmark image, on the right-hand side the exposure corrected 5 full stops underexposed image. You see there is some grain and noise kicking in, which is totally normal. And if we calculate then the difference image, of course, we can see what the metrics tell us, and the mean square error here is now significantly higher than what we saw before in the examples, 167.2. The peak signal to noise ratio is still kind of acceptable, but at the lower end, 25.9 in absolute value. The average pixel value is 10.4, which means there is some brightness going on in the difference image. And the structural similarity index you saw before, we had higher values in the examples. Here we have now 48.17%. So this is below 50% in terms of similarity, what the human eye will perceive looking at these images. And we actually see it here. If you look at these two images, looking at this with your naked eye, you see that the right-hand side image is more grainy, more noisy, and has lower quality than the benchmark image on the left-hand side. I also want to show here the difference image of that particular situation here. And you see there is structure, there are areas of brightness in the difference image. And that, of course, contributes to the average pixel value here of 10.4, average pixel value, of course. And the difference image here clearly shows that these two images are different, as we see here, as mentioned before, with our naked eyes. It's just totally normal that underexposing by 5 full stops, that's a huge underexposure, and then correcting in Lightroom creates a different image than the benchmark image. Totally normal, nothing that surprises me. Here the measurement results in the same way as before. I'll skip them. I did the same exercise now with the Q3 43. And for the Q3 43, of course, we have a different field of view. It's a 43mm lens. But in terms of the exercise we are doing when we compare, you know, underexposed images, let's call them generally against stressed images with a benchmark image, there's nothing different in the procedure. It's just a different field of view. And also here we get a table. So this is the Q3 28. This is the Q3 43. And now I collected them all into one common table. And since this is still a bit tedious in the video to look at them, I actually came up with another Python script which visualizes these different values so I can easier explain them to you. So let's look into structural similarity index first, because out of these 4 benchmarks, that's probably the most natural one. Remember what I said before, the SSIM is telling you whether from a human visual perception perspective, the stressed image and the benchmark image are kind of similar or how different they are. And what you see is a chart with 3 curves, 3 colors, green, and you see this in the upper right-hand side corner. Green stands for the GFX, red stands for the Q3 28, and blue stands for the Q3 43. And to describe the chart a little bit, on the horizontal axis, the x-axis, you see the type of stress I imposed on the stressed image. So underexposure, overexposure, high ISO values, that's the type of stress I imposed. On the vertical axis, on the y-axis, you see the value for the structural similarity index. And the first observation here is all 3 cameras are well performing in terms of human visual perception similarity. Forget for a moment about 4 stops and 5 stops of underexposure where you get significantly lower values. In dynamic range tests I published on my channel over many years, I typically restrict myself to 3 stops of underexposure. And I do typically not go for 4 stops or 5 stops, but here, you know, it was fun to do it. And it's additional data we can look into to get some insights. But these 3 curves are quite consistent. Now, what is eye-catching is that the red curve is always on top. So in terms of SSIM performance, the Leica Q3 20A clearly wins this competition. And that is an astonishing result, in my opinion. In highlight recovery, in shadow recovery, in high ISO performance, it's always the Leica Q3 20A which gives the best performance when it comes to the structural similarity, as I said, the human visual perception similarity. And then there's a second group, which includes the Q3 43 and the GFX. So the blue curve and the green curve, they are kind of almost the same. They are pretty similar in shadow recovery and in highlight recovery and in medium high ISO performance. There's only a difference where the Q3 43 performs significantly better, and that's at an ISO value of 25,600, which by the way is consistent. We come back to this all the time. Astonishingly enough, the medium format sensor in the Fuji has not a better, but a worse high ISO performance than the Leica Q3 cameras. That's a consistent observation I made throughout the exercise. Let's move on to the MSE comparison. We have the same color scheme, green for the Fuji, Q3 28 is in red, Q3 43 is in blue. I kept the same colors, of course, in order not to confuse anyone. And if you look at these curves, we see also kind of a consistent shape of the curves, but we also see significant differences. And let's start from the top. I noted this all down for you so you can follow me on the presentation. First of all, the GFX100RF consistently has the lowest mean squared error when we under or overexpose and apply this type of stress to the stressed image. You see the green curve is always doing better except for the 2 high ISO values, and that's lining up with what I said just a moment ago. The ISO behavior of the medium format sensor is not as good as the ISO behavior of the 2 Leica Q3 sensors. And that's for me personally an astonishing result. On the Q3 43, this camera performs well, in particular when deviating by 3 stops only. And there are some inconsistencies at 4 stops underexposure, which is something we also see on the Leica Q3 28. The Q3 28 has the most inconsistent curve, which could also be due to adaptive image processing, you know. And I will mention this again when I conclude the video. But we have here a superposition of effects which finally produce the final raw file in the camera on the SD card. It's of course the sensor. This is most of the time a sensor-related performance we are looking into here. But there is a lens on top of the sensor and the light passes through that lens. And there is image and signal processing and calibration of all of that going on in the camera, and that can create, of course, inconsistencies here. And we also see that if we sum this image up, the GFX100RF clearly wins the exposure flexibility game, where you can overexpose, underexpose, whereas the Q3 43 wins the ISO flexibility game, because here we have the lowest MSE when we look at the blue curve at an ISO of 12,800 and an ISO of 25,600. Let's move on to the peak signal to noise ratio comparison. This image looks a bit wilder. Let's start with the red curve, which stands for the Q3 28 again. And here on average, we see weaker performance than on the other 2 cameras. And that is something which is consistent now throughout the exercise. I will summarize this later. But from a structural similarity index before, we saw that the Q3 28 is superior and has the best performance. So if a human being looks at how similar are the stressed image compared to the benchmark image, then if the images are produced by the Q3 28, you will think they have the best performance. If we look into the technical metrics here, like PSNR, then the Q3 28 actually is the weakest here. The Q3 43 is much stronger here if you look at the blue curve than its 28mm sibling. And then, since by the technical explanations I provide in that video I flagged and referenced before, the PSNR and the MSE are inversely related, the Fuji GFX100RF is again the clear winner here of the exposure flexibility game, because the peak signal to noise ratio on the green curve is always the highest, except, I'm repeating myself, at the too high ISO values. Here we need to pay attention. The medium format sensor has a worse ISO performance than the two full frame sensors in the Q3 cameras. Interesting, right? Last metric I want to look into is the average pixel value. So that's the average level of intensity and light in the difference image. And here, if you look at the green curve, remember what I said before, the lower the APV, the better. And the green, again, is winning this, except, and this is the last time I'm saying it, for the two high ISO values. Here, the APV is the highest, which means from a light intensity perception at the pixel level, the Fuji has the worst performance. If you look at the Q3 the blue curve again, it follows more or less the green curve, so the GFX100RF with two exceptions, at 4 stops underexposure and 3 stops overexposure. Then we have a worse value, a significantly worse value than what we see on the Fuji GFX100RF. And the Q3 has less deviations than the other two cameras, but behaves with respect to APV on average as the worst, which is also interesting. So if we now do a little bit of a SWOT analysis, so SWOT stands for the strengths, the weaknesses, the opportunities, and the threats. That's the SWOT. And we look into that. I tried now to feed in also all aspects and observations I mentioned in part 1 of this comparison. Then if we go on the strength side, the Fujifilm clearly has the highest resolution. It has advantages because we have dual SD card slots. We don't have that on the Leica cameras. We also don't have internal memory on the Leica Q3 cameras like we have, for instance, on the M11P. So for pro shooters, if you are a wedding photographer, you don't have a natural solution for backup, right? If the SD card in your Leica Q3 camera is breaking down and going bust during the shooting, you will lose all your footage except you have an online connection and uploaded them already to the Leica Photos app. On the Fujifilm GFX100RF, you have that safeguard because you know you have dual SD card slots. You can set this up in the menu that every image is ending up on both cards, and the likelihood that both cards break down at the same time is basically 0. We also have more features on the GFX camera than we have on the Leica Q3 cameras. We have a built-in neutral density filter. We have focus bracketing, which is great for macro shooting. We don't have these features in the Leica Q3 cameras, but we have image stabilization in the lens on the Q3 cameras, which enables longer handheld shooting. We have higher video resolution of 8K compared to 4K. We have a pretty solid high ISO performance on both cameras. We saw that. The Fuji is worse on the ISO performance. And what always peaks up for me on the Leica Q3 is that absolutely brilliant focal length of 43mm. And then last but not least, if you look at these 4 charts I showed before, you can very likely probably conclude that from a technical perspective, in terms of how clean are the images, you know, how well do they perform, if you look into technical metrics, the Fuji, as I mentioned before, is the clear winner, except on the structural similarity index. Here it's the Leica Q3 and I think it's fair, and you might comment on that, but if you look into these medium format pictures, sometimes they look a bit too clean for me, too sterile. Whereas on the Leica Q3, the Leica Q3 these images clearly have soul. And on the Q3 we saw in the technical analysis, they are a bit more clean than on the Leica Q3 but both cameras produce images with soul and character. Some people describe this as the Leica look, which is hard to really get your hands on what it means. But I think here from the analysis, if we look and compare the difference between these cameras from an SSIM perspective compared to all the other 3 metrics, there's clearly some evidence here which we see. On the weaknesses side, I mentioned a lot of things already when we discussed strength, because with strengths on the other side, on the flip side of the coin, come also weaknesses. But clearly we have the limit of an f4 widest open aperture on the GFX100RF. I mentioned this before in the last videos. I wished Fuji would have given it at least a widest open of f2.8, but they didn't. And that is something we cannot change. Another aspect I want to mention on the weakness side is The Fujifilm is way off superior when it comes to battery life. More than 800 shots with one battery load compared to CIPA standards. On the two Leica Q3 cameras, you only have 350 according to CIPA. Opportunities. What are these cameras for? Well, the Fujifilm GFX100RF is an ideal camera for professionals in landscape, architecture, reportage. Here you want to have clear image. You want to capture as much information as possible. You want to have that level of detail 102 megapixel sensor will deliver to you. The Fuji is an unbeatable camera if you need highest details. It is also a niche medium format camera. I'm not aware of another medium format compact camera, and technically, as we saw in the analysis on these four metrics, it's the most accurate camera. It has the best performance when we compare the stressed images with the benchmark images, except for the structural similarity index and except on the two very high ISO values I looked into. The Q3 is an excellent hybrid camera for still images and for high resolution video. It's a travel camera, a reportage camera, a street camera. What I love about a 43mm, it's a normal focal length. It's also great for people photography, for portraits. It's ideal for fashion photography. If you are a fashion blogger, you want a very compact, handleable camera which fits in every backpack, in every handbag. This is the camera for you. And by the way, from a technical analysis perspective, it's keeping up quite well with the GFX100RF in various metrics. I mentioned this before. Quite often I said the blue curve and the green curve, they are quite close. The Leica Q3 is a great all-rounder. There is one big difference between the 43mm Q3 and the 28mm Q3. On the 43mm, you can of course not get a wider angle. Wider is not possible. You might overcome this with panorama stitching. I think I showed this once on my channel, but that's end of story. You will not get wider. If you need wide landscape, if you want to go to a wider perspective, that's not possible. Whereas on the Q3 if you accept digitally cropping in, you can actually simulate longer focal lengths. So there's more flexibility on the Q3 It's an ideal camera for travel and reportage. I used this camera for quite some years. It's one of my most favorite cameras, although right now, based on the people photography capabilities I have on the Q3 I would probably say I like my Q3 43mm a tiny little bit more than the 28mm Q3. But that's basically on the opportunity side what we have. What are the threats for these cameras? Well, on the GFX100RF, of course, if you don't have image stabilization, handheld shooting longer is difficult. On the Q3 cameras, you can go longer based on optical image stabilization. And I think in general, you have here clearly a disadvantage if you have no optical image stabilization. You have in all three cameras no in-body image stabilization, of course. Another aspect I want to mention, and I mentioned this in part 1, in my opinion, the GFX100RF doesn't feel as robust as the Q3 cameras. I think in particular, the door covering the ports on the left-hand side of the camera body looks very vulnerable, very plasticky, not really valuable to me. I don't know why they did not find a better mechanism here, a better coverage for these ports. And that is something which I want to mention here too. Now, let me quickly summarize my conclusions. First of all, from a technical perspective, if we look into these four metrics, in 3 metrics out of 4, the GFX100RF is technically the best. A clear winner when it comes to the metrics from signal analysis I used here in my comparison. The Q3 very often in the curve, the blue and the green, they are quite close. That means the Q3 perfectly balances technical performance and the Leica look and soul and character we are used to from aposummicron lenses and from Summilux lenses. But Summilux lenses are always even more filled with soul and character. And on the Leica Q3 I safely can claim, yes, it's technically the weakest, but when it comes to human perception, the way you see the images, you will find them more similar than from a technical perspective they really are. And that is what you probably want to achieve. So from an SSIM performance, the Leica Q3 clearly is the winner. And as a quick disclaimer at the end, before I come to 2 other aspects I want to quickly mention. Of course, I mentioned this before, the images we get result from a combination of sensor performance, the lens on top of the sensor, and in-camera image processing calibration. This explains to me some of the inconsistencies we discovered in some of the curves. So these three cameras, in particular when it comes to SSIM, they are all three fantastic. If you are a technical shooter, if you need the highest detail, go for the Fuji. You will get very happy with that camera. If you don't care overly much about technical cleanness, you want to have more soul, more character, you want in particular convince human beings looking at the photos that stressed images are kind of almost the same as benchmark images, the Q3 28 is unbeatable. If you want to have the best compromise between the three, then the Q3 43 is the camera to go to. Now, I want to mention a couple of other points because here's an opportunity to do this. If I show you an image shot with the Fuji GFX100RF and I turned this mechanical control wheel, which switches from a 4:3 aspect ratio to a 3:2 aspect ratio, then I should actually get, give or take, the field of view of 28mm. Why is this so? Because if you remember what I said in part 1 of the video, the focal length of the GFX is 35mm. Applying a crop factor of 0.79 to 35 gives 28mm in a full frame equivalent field of view. And if I then, in addition, change the aspect ratio from 4:3, which is the natural aspect ratio of the sensor, to a 3:2, which is the natural aspect ratio of a full frame sensor, I should actually get the same field of view as the Q328. But that is not the case. That's why in my headline here I say, has the Q328 really a focal length of 28mm? And there's a lot of debate and discussion going on in the web. I don't know if someone really found proof. If you know that, then please drop me a comment on it. But if you look at that image and I flip forth and back now with the same image shot with the Q328, you see this is Fuji, Q328, Fuji, Q328. Do you notice something? Yes, you do. The Leica Q3 image has a wider field of view. So I actually don't think that the focal length of the Q3 28mm really is 28mm, because then it should look like this, but it looks wider. So I thought, why not taking a Nikon C8 and a 26mm lens on the Nikon C8 and shooting that very same image and then comparing with the Q328. Now have a look if I switch forth and back between these images. Leica, Nikon, Leica, Nikon. Looks much more similar than Leica and Fuji, right? So I think actually the focal length, the true focal length of the Leica Q328 is a little bit more than 26mm, but definitely not 28mm. The second one concerns the widest open aperture of f4 of the Fuji camera again. And if you look at that image in particular, if you would shoot portraits, if you would go to a nearer distance, like here, I'm pretty close to my model Jennifer, you can actually separate the foreground, Jennifer in this case, from the background. An aperture of f4 is not as bad as we all think, guys. There are worse things in the world than a widest open aperture of f4. Yes, it should have been an f2.8, but with an f4, as I mentioned a couple of times in the last videos, I can fairly well live. And you see there is a nice separation here between a sharp foreground, namely Jennifer, and a very blurry and fuzzy background. And that's it. That concludes my comparison. Part 1 I delivered, part 2 I delivered. I know a lot of you waited for this video. If you like my content, this is a lot of work, guys. Seriously. And my subscriber number is hardly going up. If you really want to help me on my channel, please spread the news that this is a worthwhile to watch video channel on YouTube, and help me to increase the number of my subscribers. If you liked that video, don't forget to drop me a thumbs up. Stay tuned on my channel, there's always more to come. Thanks for watching, stay safe and healthy, and of course, peace out.